Good evening and welcome to the Little Rock Church of Christ. We can find our seats. We'll begin this evening. We appreciate the presence of each one, especially those visiting with us. You're our honored guests. My wife is telling me that I need to adjust the mic. Does that work better? Okay, good. We're continuing our series this evening, dealing with some of the issues that have divided brethren over the years. It's a sensitive issue. It's one that pains my heart. It's a controversy that I lived through, and it wasn't fun. The question of how churches cooperate and some of the functioning of the church has been an issue from the very earliest history of the church. And as we look at the beginning of apostasy, that's usually where you see the departure with the organization of the church, and you see it developing gradually till ultimately you see the kind of hierarchy that we have with the Roman Catholic Church. We started with the subject of authority and then looked at the all-sufficiency of God's organization, which I think is one of the fundamental questions and challenges. People are not really satisfied with God's organization. They've got to augment, they've got to go beyond what they find in Scripture. The title this evening, Congregational Cooperation, was the title of a tract that was written by my father, published in 1955, as the controversy was really heating up and beginning. I was 2 years old. No, actually 14, I believe, 67 years ago. It was responded to by church bulletins, and issues developed. The Birmingham debate was one of the results about 2 years later, which resulted in brethren studying the issue, looking at what the Bible said, and I believe that out of 53 congregations in the Birmingham area where we were at the time, 51 of them took a stand for what I'm convinced is the truth. And it was the result of studying together, not yelling and screaming and calling names, and there was a lot of that going on. The answer to the question, can congregations cooperate, obviously is yes. We see that in the New Testament. But they are governed by the principles that we find in the New Testament. Not just what Jesus said. Sometimes people will say, well, I want to see where Jesus said it. That attitude indicates they don't believe what Jesus said. He said to the apostles, Matthew 18, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. You better pay attention to what the apostles said, because that's what's bound in heaven. Whatever they bind, whatever you loose on earth, will have been loosed in heaven. The orders that were given by the apostles were to be respected as if that was from Christ. They were ambassadors, divinely authorized to speak for the king. And Paul speaks to the church at Corinth and says, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. These weren't suggestions. These were orders conveyed from the king by the apostles, by the ambassadors. Paul was writing to Timothy, 1 Timothy 4. These things not suggest, not a good idea in the sense that it's just a good idea, but command and and teach. And then again in chapter 5, these things command that they may be blameless. If they don't follow what's commanded, then they will be blamed. The return to New Testament Christianity is based on the scriptural demands, the commands. The restoration to New Testament Christianity is based on that concept, but it is accompanied and has been through history by alienation and division and bitterness and discouragement. And the question of congregational cooperation has been one of the earliest. As we pointed out in our last lesson, the all-sufficiency of the church, there is one organization that God specified, and it's the largest and the smallest and the onlyest congregation or organization that is a functional arrangement through which God gave his people to accomplish his work. There have been all kinds of wrong answers about how that church functions. The right answer is, of course, what the apostles commanded. It is described in the New Testament as that which is autonomous and independent and equal and sufficient, which was a good portion of our lesson in the last session. I think 1 Peter 5 and verse 2 is a passage that cuts off the apostasy right at the beginning, that provides a wall of protection. The extent of the authority of the local congregation is defined. You oversee not a dozen congregations. You don't turn your oversight, or at least part of the work of the oversight of the congregation, over to an organization or to a super congregation. You, the local congregation, oversees that flock which is among you. And when you do that, you have a wall of protection against the hierarchical developments that necessarily follow. Once we go over God's wall of protection, there'll be no stopping this side of Rome. That local church is the organization that is sufficient to accomplish evangelism and edification and benevolence, which are the areas of work God specified for the local church. God's organization is sufficient. Man's organizations are rebellion, unauthorized. That local church is absolutely sufficient to accomplish that, but again and again through history we see God's people are not satisfied with that. We need something bigger and something better and something more efficient. And even Alexander Campbell, as we pointed out, who helped establish and re-establish New Testament Christianity, ultimately through the influence of his son-in-law, I believe, became dissatisfied and expressed that very word. With the local organization, you need something to activate the church universal. You find the church universal referred to in the New Testament, but no organization, no machinery, and it cannot function without that. It was a relationship, it's not an organization. The organization only is that local congregation. But we find human organizations added to the plan that we find in the New Testament that resulted in the Missionary Society about 1850, and then continuing to develop for the next 50 years, beginning with edification. They argued, well, we're not surrendering our autonomy. We voluntarily decide to turn the funds over to this organization that is more efficient than the one God ordained. And whether they voluntarily give up the oversight or whether it is required of them is really immaterial. It's given up. I've talked to a number of Baptist preachers who will defend their Baptist associations exactly the same way. We voluntarily decide to send delegates and to send money and to turn this oversight of this work. This is our decision to do that. But then it is given over to that organization, and whether they voluntarily give it over or it's taken from them is really not material to the principle. The Missionary Society for Edification was just a stepping stone. The United Christian Missionary Society followed, which then was for evangelism, edification, benevolence, and everything the church determined to do, which virtually resulted in limiting the local churches to money-raising institutions so that the United Christian Missionary Society could take over and oversee the work that God gave the churches to do. We could go into more, but we did deal with this at length in the previous lesson. They understood that principle for a number of years and then reintroduced the principle as they turned funds over to a Brotherhood Orphan Home or organization board of directors to oversee the work of benevolence. And the emotion that was associated with that blinded the eyes of seeing that this was exactly the same principle. That local church has the oversight of work that God gave the church to do. Individual does all kinds of work at the individual's discretion and may form organizations at the individual's discretion, but the church is to function as God ordained through the all-sufficient organization that He authorized. Absolutely sufficient. And so the question then that we want to look at this evening is, can churches scripturally cooperate? And sometimes people who object to unscriptural arrangements are accused of not believing in cooperation, which is one of the few things of many that are false accusations. We do see a difference, I believe, in the pattern in the New Testament. When we're talking about evangelism, when we're talking about benevolence. And we might raise the question, why would there be a difference? And the difference is in the relationship of the congregations to evangelism and benevolence. I think all churches are equally related to the responsibility to preach the gospel to the world. There's not one super church to preach the gospel, and little churches that are subjugated all have the responsibility, according to their opportunity and ability, to do the best they can, and that is their responsibility. In benevolence, you have those in abundance and those in need. They're not equally related, and the help is to produce an equality. And so we see a difference, and we can see that in the pattern. Certainly the answer is yes, they can cooperate, and the Bible is specific. In all the New Testament examples, we see a pattern that is consistent in evangelism. Philippians chapter 4, verse 16 says, "For even in Thessalonica you sent a gift more than once for my needs." They were supporting the Apostle Paul, not through an organization or through a sponsoring church, but Paul was in need, they sent the money to him. That's really not hard to understand. It's not very showy. It doesn't make a big splash, and you don't pile it up and say, wow, look at what we're doing. This is God's wisdom, and man just ought to take a back seat and just follow what God did and said. Likewise, we see the cooperation with the evangelist here demonstrated. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, I robbed other churches, plural, taking wages from them to minister to you. And so there were times when he received money from several other churches. That was not through a board of directors. It was not through a super church or sponsoring church. They sent to the evangelist, and each church was just as equal and autonomous as the other. There were no super organizations. There were no super elderships. Scripture limits the extent of oversight to the flock which is among them, and they're overseeing their work. They're not turning it over to another organization or another congregation. I believe that arrangement is sufficient without super organizations or super elderships. But today we see sending churches sending to sponsoring churches, and sponsoring churches competing with other sponsoring churches for the money of smaller subjugated churches who've given over their funds to be overseen by the big churches. I just am amazed that brethren don't look for authority for that. They just think it's a good idea. But the sponsoring church arrangement is not found in the New Testament. Sponsoring church controls the work of dozens of congregations, and that is just totally different from what we see illustrated in the New Testament pattern. This is not as showy. It's not something that would impress our wisdom perhaps, but it worked. Alexander Campbell said we need a more efficient organization. I think God's is perfectly sufficient. Well, how efficient was it? Colossians chapter 1, Paul says, the gospel that you've heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven. That was about 30 years worth of work, and they proclaimed the gospel to all creation under heaven through how many missionary societies? Under the oversight of how many sponsoring churches, super churches, overseeing the work of other churches? None of that in that which Peter says is sufficient. All things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of Jesus Christ. And if we have all that pertains to life and godliness revealed through Christ, then something beyond that is not part of life and godliness according to God. With that organization, they were sufficient and very successful. 1 Peter chapter 5, here I exhort the elders, shepherd the flock of God which is among you, exercising the oversight. Not a big plan, not a showy plan, and you don't have everybody saying, ooh, look at this great eldership that's doing, of course, collecting money from others, overseeing the work of hundreds of congregations in many instances, is not what Peter is saying. That's a very different situation. Overseeing the flock which is among you. There are really two implications there. You don't oversee more than the flock which is among you. You don't oversee less than the flock which is among you. But if you have 100 churches giving funds for evangelism over to one church, then they're not overseeing all of their work, and the one church is overseeing more than their work. You've got a double violation. The Herald of Truth, which has now disappeared, replaced by a dozen other situations similar, was an arrangement where churches sent to one eldership to oversee and direct the work. And it's defended by saying, well, the congregations exercise their autonomy by deciding to contribute or not to contribute, which is exactly what the Baptist preacher said about the Baptist Association. We decide whether to turn funds over to the association or not. But the funds are overseen by one congregation for hundreds of congregations. Had a friend of mine, Brother Harold Dowdy, who several years ago decided to develop a snapshot of what was going on among the churches with which he was familiar, and he had been preaching the gospel for a number of years and pretty well familiar with what was happening among our brethren. Beginning with the Highland Church, he pointed out that yes, there are hundreds of congregations that are contributing their funds to be overseen by the church at Highland to preach the gospel and the herald of truth. They, of course, also contribute to the Gunter Home, and they contribute to the work in Oklahoma and in Indiana. And so they're sending through the Highland Church to these various other churches, some down in Mexico. They also send to the Broadway Church, which is itself a sponsoring church, which has the Children's Home and a German fund and a Bible chair, a separate organization not overseen by that eldership. And there are dozens of churches that send to the Broadway Church, and the Broadway Church is competing with the Highland Church for the funds in order to more efficiently preach the gospel and do the work of the church. They, of course, send also to the Herald of Truth under the Highland Elders, so you've got dollars going back and forth and round. They send to the East Side Church in Lubbock, and then that East Side Church in Lubbock sent to the Mexican church. So you send to this one, you send to that one, and then to this one in Texas. They send money. They're the sponsoring church for the work in Italy, and so you send to East Side to send to the church in Texas, which then sends. There's a lot of sending going on, and many times those dollars get sent half a dozen times before they ever get spent. He counted each time, but you wonder if it gets spent sometimes. They also send to the church in Manhattan, which sponsors the work in Germany. They send to the Pioneer Park, and which in turn sends to Las Vegas, New Mexico. And then there's the Central Church in Houston with their home, and then lots of churches send in. So the Highland Church and the Broadway Church and the Central Church in Houston are all competing for the funds of the little churches. And then the Central Church sends back to Highland after having received funds. Both send to the Gunter Home. And on the dollars go in all directions. If it's God's will that one church seek control of the abundance of other churches when they're not in want to promote a program of their own design, then why isn't it the responsibility of all churches to do that? And so we've got the embarrassing situation where all churches are competing for funds so that they can do big work, and the best money raisers are the ones that are most successful. I don't have to point out there's nothing like that in the New Testament. That's in stark contrast to the simple picture that we find in the Bible. This is man's rebellion. It is not God's wisdom, and it's just effectively man's foolishness. One church never sent to another church in the area of evangelism in the New Testament. Now that just strikes some as being very strange, but it ought to strike them as being very scriptural. And maybe they think about why. Well, they're all equally related to the work of preaching the gospel. And so they don't need to send to other churches to help provide a need as opposed to abundance like we find in benevolence. They're equally related, and so they equally function. That's the pattern. Now, the Hebrew writer reminded the Christians to whom he was writing that when Moses made the house of God in the Old Testament, which was foreshadowing the house of God that we have today, you had to follow the pattern. They started adding things that they thought were good ideas and changing the arrangement. We know exactly what would happen. We saw what happened with Nadab and Abihu when they were trying to do God's work, but didn't do it the way God said do it. God's arrangement is required. Now, let's move to another question, or at least a similar question, but a different phase of it. What about benevolence? And as we pointed out, there is a difference in the pattern. The answer is certainly yes. Churches can cooperate, and we see that in the New Testament. But as we indicated, Hebrews 8 warns Christians by looking at the building of the tabernacle as an example, make all things according to the pattern. Well, there is a pattern in benevolence in the New Testament. And the pattern is clearly stated in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. This is not for the ease of others, for your affliction. He's talking about contribution to the church in Jerusalem that was in need, famine. It's not for the ease of others, but by way of equality. That was the goal. Now, they were already equal in the area of evangelism, but not so in benevolence. Some were in need, some were in want. He says, at this present time, which says this is not for all time. This is temporary. This is for now because of the situation that exists now that won't exist in the future. At this present time, your abundance being a supply for their need, so that their abundance may also become a supply for your need. The present circumstances, temporary circumstances, may be reversed, in which case the action is reversed. The receiving church doesn't just keep on receiving and trying to see how much it can generate. This is temporary. At the present time, their abundance is a supply for your need, that there may be equality. Now, that's not what we saw in the picture we looked at a moment ago. It's what we see in the New Testament regarding the pattern for benevolence, that there may be equality. And that's destroyed when one church just continues to receive, the other continues to give regardless of the need abundance relationship. He gives an illustration to help people understand. There was a circumstance in the Old Testament, again, that was a pattern. It's like or similar to, an analogy, to the situation he's describing here as they were collecting the manna. Sometimes people would get greedy and gather too much, and God took care of that. They got into trouble as a result. But he who gathered too much and he who gathered little had no lack. The one who it just worked out so that the one who got more, the one who got less, still wound up with the same, so that there was a solution. There was no lack. Now that is an illustration of the pattern that he's stating here in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. The principles that we see clearly delineated, temporary, at this time, not for all time, not a rule that continues. It is now because of present circumstances which will disappear. The conditions were an abundance meeting a need. Sometimes that was reversed, and when it reversed, the actions would reverse. The goal was that there may be equality. Now that's not a complicated pattern. It cuts off one continuing to receive and seeking to be superior over others. It produces equality, which is God's goal. There is a church in abundance and a church in need. Now, you don't start out with this condition in evangelism. They are equal at all times, depending on their ability and opportunity. But not so in benevolence. Here is a sending church and a receiving church that are in different circumstances, but that is given that there may be equality. And when that circumstance is reversed, then the action is reversed, and you don't have the sending church continuing to send even when the need has been satisfied, so that this receiving church can continue to get greater and greater. That doesn't exist in the New Testament. But the goal is that there may be equality. Now, that's not optional, and it's not unclear, though I talk to a lot of brethren who have no idea that passage is in the Bible, that it describes the way brethren are to conduct themselves toward other churches in the area of benevolence. But it's plain and it's clear and it's specific. It is commanded and it is bound in heaven. And we better not be found violating it. When you find this kind of arrangement, it is dramatically violated. It is not the equality that God specified. Dollars getting counted half a dozen times before it's ever spent sponsoring churches, competing for church dollars. This kind of nonsense never happened in the New Testament. Now, when you object to it, they can't say, well, here's book, chapter, and verse. They have to say something, and they object and say, you don't believe in cooperation. And that's just not the truth. We believe in doing it according to the principles we find in the New Testament. We're restoring New Testament Christianity. We have to follow the New Testament. It's interesting to look at it from the historical perspective, where the same kind of questions that we see today, really not questions, just dogmatic affirmations, but questions were raised as they were discussing these very issues. David Lipscomb, together with E.J. Sewell, editors of the Gospel Advocate, this back in 1921, that each church that is able support a preacher of the gospel, talking here about evangelism,